I don't know if your team won or lost over the Thanksgiving holidays. If they lost, I'm sorry. If they won, well, great. Some of you probably don't know or remember that I played football for a couple years as a lumberjoke. That's what they called us back then, from Stephen F. Austin, the Lumberjacks. And so anyway, this past week, SFA beat Duke at home. So wow, that was a big deal, man. So way to go, SFA. I didn't watch the Aggie LSU game yesterday. It was amazing. That must have been an LSU fan, I guess. So anyway, well, we got lots to talk about this morning as we're trying to finish up thinking about why it is that we're a Baptist. Why do we go to a Baptist church? And so we really are getting to like the Baptist beginnings in America, and that's where we're going to kind of close it out. And then Matt next Sunday is going to talk about Lottie Moon. We talk about Lottie Moon every year. A lot of people don't know who she was, the ministry that she had, and she had quite a dynamic life. And so he's going to help us with that next week. We have a couple scriptures as we think about our text today. One is in Luke chapter 9 and verse 52. And sent messengers before his face, and as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?" But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went to other villages. So they're in Samaria, Jesus and the disciples, and the Samaritans don't want them to, that particular area of Samaria didn't want Jesus and his disciples to stick around, because they knew he was headed for Jerusalem, and they're kind of like in competition with Jerusalem, that kind of thing. And so James and John have this thought and feeling of, well, let's just kill them all. You wouldn't think that was your average disciple back then, somebody disagrees with us, somebody doesn't like us, let's just burn them up. And really, that really wasn't the right attitude, was it? It was kind of a bad attitude and a bad thought. And Jesus said, hey, the whole purpose I came for is to save people, not destroy them. Hello. And of course, God changed James and John after they Pentecost. When they got saved, when the Holy Spirit came in their life, that's when God changed their life, just as he changed their life, changed our thinking, all that kind of stuff. So they were just being really Jewish. I mean, that's the way Jews thought, back in that day, about Samaritans. And that kind of thought that they had was really, as we've been looking at the last few weeks, a thought of much of church history. And it carried over all the way with the Puritans across the pond. So we have much to talk about. One of the things we want to look at as an overall theme is this idea of our heart, our own beliefs, our own convictions, our own opinions, the conclusions that we make on our own lives. Whose property is that? One of the people that we need to really understand, among others, is James the First. He starts his reign in 1603 and goes for quite a while. He reaffirmed this particular saying. It's called the divine right. That meant something. Here's what it means. Here's what it meant. It meant that the monarch, the king, owned your heart. He owned what you thought. He owned your beliefs. He owned your convictions. He not only owned what was internal, he also owned, obviously, what was external. Everything about you was under his jurisdiction. It was under his authority. And he was above the law, so that the law could not prosecute him, but he was only responsible to God. So this is now the Anglican Church of England during James's day and following James. So there were several groups that came out of that. One of those groups were separatists. They didn't like a lot of things about the Anglican Church. Part of those separatists were the Pilgrims that we looked at last Sunday. But many of the people in England were called Puritans. We've talked about them for several weeks. And the Puritans who go to America, they are still somewhat in this divine right. So they put themselves under the authority of the monarch, in this case, the King of England, whoever that is. They have not separated themselves from this system. But it is a little different because they want to change this. They want to change this paradigm. And so when they come to America, they become covenant practice religionists, if you will. Okay? Covenant. They make a covenant with the people, with the civil magistrate. So the government and the people make a covenant together, and we're talking about particularly in Massachusetts, particularly like in the Boston area. By the time we get to 1630, remember the Pilgrims landed in 10 years later, there's 30,000 people living in Massachusetts. There's only a few hundred Pilgrims down south. So lots of Puritans in Massachusetts. And they are all living under this covenant theology. This is not a separation of church and state. This is they're together. Let me just say that. They're together on this thing. And so the majority of the people have come together and they've set the laws. They've made this covenant. And so they, being the magistrate, have jurisdiction again over what's internal in your life. And they say that not only about what you think, about what you believe, but about the way you live. Where did they get this kind of thinking? Well, they've deviated a little bit, obviously, from King James, because now they're taking the jurisdiction themselves, even though they're still under the king, but they're ruling really without him because they're in the New World. And the king doesn't really care that much because they're way across the Atlantic. But it's interesting where they get this thinking from. These people are Geneva Bible thumpers. Remember, Calvin is the one, along with Beza and Stephanus, who write the Geneva Bible. It's a good Bible. It's a good text. But the notes are a problem. Because in the notes, Calvin degrades the monarchy. It's not a problem for us, but he degrades the monarchy. And so this is why James says we need a new Bible. When they came out of the committee and the guy offered that last suggestion of let's get a new Bible to compete with Calvin's Bible, King James says, yeah, let's do that, because he hated the Geneva Bible because of the notes, not because of the text. And the King James Bible came as a result of the notes because it was degrading the monarchy. No bishop, no king. And so Calvin he's saying, no, what we need this structure. And Calvin's structure is this civil magistrate, this civil authority that combines with the church. So there's no separation of church and state in Calvin's mind. Case in point. A guy by the name of Severitas, Spanish guy. He doesn't believe in the Trinity. He lives in Spain. They try him for heresy. They convict him. They put him in prison. He escapes. So he's on his journey to escape from Spain, and he decides he wants to go through Switzerland to wherever he's going. And he had already been going back and forth with Calvin with letters about the Trinity. And he's asking questions, and he's trying to get answers, and Calvin is kind of, not really being real nice to him in the letters. And anyway, he's corresponding. So as he's going through Switzerland, he decides, and he's incognito, he decides, hey, I heard, he hears Calvin is preaching in the pulpit that Sunday. I think I'll just go to church and listen to what he has to say. He's out in the congregation. Calvin recognizes him, has him arrested on the spot, taken out of the church. They try him. They find him guilty of heresy because he didn't believe, like you and I would believe, in the Trinity, and they burned him at the stake. This is Calvin. This is under Calvin's leadership. Okay? This civil magistrate model is what the Puritans who come to Massachusetts take with them. Now, they are not going to be as severe, obviously, as Calvin, kinda. Because when you get in the late 1600s, you have the Salem witch trials. And this is where it all begins to really fall apart. And the Puritans really regret this later on. And it's based on innuendo and hearsay and opinion. It's really some teenage girls trying to save face and save their own skin and saying things about other women that were not true. And it just went south in a spiral downward, and so some women lost their lives. But most of the Puritan effort was obviously not like that. That was just a small little microcosm. But they still, if you deviated from what they dictated for what you were to believe and the way you were to practice, you're going to get in trouble in Massachusetts. You're going to get in trouble in Boston. So case in point, there's a guy by the name of Hooker, and he's going to say no. He's one of the first guys. He's going to say no. There in the late 1630s, he's going to talk about freedom between church and state. And he's going to say, these guys are not going to go with this. And he's going, and obviously I'm not going to be able to practice this kind of thing here. And so he's going to go up and he's going to found Connecticut. And the system of government that he's going to give to the colony of Connecticut, John Adams is going to use that for the Constitution. Another guy by the name of, in the mid-1600s, John Locke. He's going to be appointed by Charles II, grandson of James I. Charles II wanted something named after him, so they came up with Charleston, which became the Carolinas. Locke is going to present a way of government for the Carolinas, again with church and state, but the separation, but more importantly, with the freedom of religious conscience. And then another guy, and they're going to use this, the framers are going to use that as well. And then the third thing that the framers are also going to use is Roger Williams. Roger Williams arrives around 629. He's a Puritan, but not for long, like for 2 weeks. He arrives in Boston. They want to appoint him to a high position there, teaching position. He says, no, I don't want it. He said, what you're doing is wrong. And so he left Massachusetts. He went down and to the Pilgrims, stayed there for a couple years and taught with them. The Pilgrims were also covenant theologians, but they're not anywhere in the same ballpark as severe as the Puritans. And so we have our 2 guys there. What are their names? The Pilgrims. What's their names? You know, the 2 main guys. Where are my notes from the early service? Huh? No, I don't have it here in front of me. I have to get it out of my brain. No, not Standish. William Bradford, and then the other guy. So he's teaching, and they're among the Pilgrims for a couple of years. Bradford and the other guy, they write about him, and they say, man, this guy's got some strange opinions. And they thought, this guy he'll probably end up being like a Baptist. And they just thought he was really strange, and he practiced some of his strange opinions too. That would never work in Massachusetts. They're not going to just say you got a strange opinion, you're going to jail, okay? So the Pilgrims are like, yeah, we just, we're not part of you. So he realizes, hey, I can't do this with the Pilgrims. So he goes back to Massachusetts, and he starts confronting some of the leaders, particularly, there are other things like taking the property away from the Indians, we should pay them for them, things like that. But basically, the main thing was separation of church and state and freedom of conscience. Jefferson and Madison are going to pick up on this later on, particularly Madison, who's going to write about internal rights, internal property, and external property. And really, the premise that's going to, Roger Williams writes his bloody tenet. And in that bloody tenet, he writes that no, the civil government does not have power over the first few commandments. Talking about the 10 commandments? You have them in 2 sets. You have your first set of commandments that are your duty to God, and the other set of commandments are your duty to people or society. And the civil government only has control over those. That's what he wrote. Well, Madison, 150 years later, comes along and says, let me just define that a little bit further. What's inside in your beliefs, your convictions, your ideas, your opinions is what we call internal property. And you have inalienable rights. They are divinely given to each person. They are sacred. They are holy. And the government does not have jurisdiction over that. But this is what Roger Williams was trying to say. And that the government should only have jurisdiction like, stealing and killing, stuff like that. How you treat others if you break the law of civil government. Well, obviously they're not going to like that. And so they try him, they convict him, and they put him in prison. And they say, we're shipping you back to England, and they're going to let the king deal with him hopefully when he gets back to England. But he escapes. And because he did a lot of ministry with the Indians, Roger did. He learned several of their languages. He kept them from several bloody battles and killing a lot of Puritans. And he wrote that it was in the wintertime when he escaped, he and his wife. And because he was friends with the Indians, they took him in. That's the only reason they survived. through the winter. So after the winter, in the spring, he goes down to Rhode Island, and there he establishes the First Baptist Church, which didn't amount to much, and he only stayed a Baptist for a few months. Here was his problem. His problem was that he believed in succession. So if you don't have apostolic succession down the ages, who's going to baptize you? And so it was a real problem for him, and he just, faded out. But another guy by the name of John something. John Clark. There we go. John Clark. He started the First Baptist Church, which was really the First Baptist Church. He started the First Baptist Church in Newport, Rhode Island. He left Massachusetts as well. Here was this group of people. There were several groups of people, not only in England, but also now in North America, and they believed three primary things. They believed in the justification by grace through faith. They believed in a gathered assembly, and that makes up the church. And they believed in believers' baptism. However, the last came late via immersion. It wasn't until the 1640s, probably 44, 48, before they really started immersing people, plunging them into the water. Which means that since the 3rd and 4th century, baptism by immersion had been AWOL. That's a long time. Now, when Allison and I went to Israel, we went to a place that had a church. Now, the church wasn't there, but it was a 3rd century church. What was still there was outside in the courtyard was their baptistry. Their baptistry was in the ground, made out of stone, and it was made in the form of a cross, and so it was level with the ground, so it went, like 4 feet down in the shape of a cross. They would fill it up with water, and then you would get in the cross, and then they would baptize you. They would plunge you in that water. That was going on in the 3rd century. Now, FYI, you had to wait 2 years after making your profession of faith. In fact, you had to wait 2 years before you could go inside the church for the worship service. So you would come to church, you would stand outside in the courtyard, they would close the doors, and you would have to stay there, you'd go to work after church service, but you would come back every Sunday, and you would have to stay outside because they were watching your behavior, because they took the Christian life so seriously. If you were to name the name of Christ, you couldn't just go do whatever. You had to really, toe the line. And after a 2-year probationary period, then you could get baptized in that cross, and then you could come into the church. So they took it very seriously. All that to say that we got the 3rd or the 4th century all the way to 1640 before we have this immersion. And this is going to happen with these groups of people that are eventually going to be called Baptist. Justification by grace through faith, a gathering together, and believers' baptism eventually by immersion. And so the Puritans, they were not, as severe as Calvin was, except for that little bitty problem there with the witch trials. But so Clark and 2 other guys, one of their members went to Massachusetts to visit. He got sick, and so Clark and 2 of the other brothers from the church went into Massachusetts and were praying over him in his home, and some other people came over to the house, and they had a Bible study. This is bad news in Boston. Bad news in Massachusetts. And so the authorities find out about it, and they arrest them, and they put them in jail. And they tell Clark and the other 2 guys, they say, look, you got 3 options. You can pay a fine, you can stay in jail, or you can be whipped. Because we don't tolerate any deviation from our covenant theology. Well, somebody paid Clark's fine, he got out. The other guy was able to post bail, but the other guy, Holmes, He says, nobody's posting my bail, and I'm not paying for it because I'm here out of conscience. I did what I believe that God wanted me to do, what he wanted me to do. And so they took him and they gave him 39 lashes. And someone wrote about it later. In fact, there was Clark that wrote about it later, and he said that Holmes was on his elbows and his knees for 3 weeks. And he had terrible scars on his back for the rest of his life. And who gave him those scars? The Puritans. The Puritans. So you didn't have this religious freedom that we all think they all came over here for. No, we're free to now tell you how you're going to act, how you're going to work, how you're going to believe, what your opinions are going to be. And all these things were working in time to give us what we have today as far as a government, as far as a republic. And God, I believe, was working behind the scenes to give us this beautiful thing we have today called the United States of America. Now, here's one of the most important reasons. Let me use the word tenet. Here's one of the most important tenets, if not the most important tenet, of what these Baptist groups believe. Now remember, Baptists, because you have pluralism, as it's beginning to develop, you're going to have people with differing views. What are people with differing views going to do? They're going to dissent. They're going to split. So you're going to have these splinters all the time, right? Just like you over in England, you have the particular and the general Baptist between Calvin's predestination and general atonement. And those people are coming over into America, into the Baptist groups in America, and so they have those same two groups, and they're going to split over that. There's a guy by the name of Munson. He's a Baptist. Munson. And Munson's going to say, no, we should meet on Saturdays. That's when we should be having church, on the Sabbath, not the first day of the week. They're going to split. And who are they going to follow? In Munson, their group's going to become who? The folks that meet down at what used to be Juniors, the Seventh-day Adventists. Okay? And Baptists, even they're not always going to get along. They get along today, but they wasn't like that in history. No, we don't really get along today either. We're working at that. But they're going to have differences of opinion. And so here's the greatest tenet. Here's the greatest tenet, and this is why I'm a Baptist. Let me just say this. I was watching last night. I didn't know much about the Hutterites. I was watching on YouTube about them, and they were actually interviewing the Hutterites there in the colony in the South Dakota, North Dakota. I don't remember which one. The Hutterites came during the time of the Reformation. They're up in Moravia. They're persecuted. They go over Transylvania. Ever heard of Transylvania? They go to Transylvania, and then many of them migrate over into the New World, along with the Moravians, the Amish, the Mennonites, all those kinds of. The Quakers go to Pennsylvania. The Hutterites. This is a good example of where I'm going here. So the Hutterites, really wonderful people. Okay, but they colonized. They take Acts where it says they had all things in common. It's like a communistic thought, okay? And they say, well, that's the way we ought to be living. Nobody owns anything. We all have everything in common, because this was the early days of the church. Well, when you're reading the Bible, you've got to understand what's prescriptive and what is descriptive. That's a descriptive thought. God is not ordering us to give up everything that we have in a common pool and we all live in a colony. But that's what they believe. And that's what is beautiful about America, is you can follow this religious conscience that you have. You are free to follow it without coercion, without duress, without being whipped, without being put in prison or put in a boat sent back to England. So I was watching them, and there's about 500 colonies in North America. There's about 30,000 of them, and they've existed for 500 years. And they follow the teachings of their leader. They read the sermons that he wrote and others after him. Those are the sermons that they read in church. And here's the thing that they will say. There's a nuance here. You have to be really careful to catch this. They say, yes, we believe in justification by grace through faith, but you receive that at the time of your baptism. And then you must continue to obey. You must continue to hold the line, or you can lose it. And then you're going to have to get it back again. Okay? And I've added some things to what they say because they're very, it's very nuanced in the way they say it. That is not what Luther was saying in the Reformation. So he comes up on Romans 5:1, and he reads it in Greek. You're not going to get this in Latin. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to read it in Greek. And what he did, again, was he separated justification from sanctification. He said they're two separate items of salvation. They're not blended together. You can't put them in a blender. And that's what the folks I just talked about were doing, along with the Catholics for centuries, even to this day. And this is why I'm a Baptist. Baptists were saying something different. Even in those early days, they came out from the Puritans. They came out as a separate separatist. Okay? So here's what this verse says. We have dikai o thin s, dikaiothenus, uk in pisteos. Okay? This is where the rubber meets the road, right here. This word right here is an aorist, passive, causal tense. Now that's important, because what this word means, dikaiao, that's the root word. Dikaiao means to justify, to declare righteous. That's the present tense. This word is not in the present tense. This word is in the aorist tense. The Apostle Paul wrote these words. And here's what he's writing. He's saying that sometime in the past, the aorist doesn't tell us when. It just says sometime in the past, we have an accomplished fact, an accomplished event. So in this case, what we have is that in the past, we were justified. We were declared righteous. Somewhere in the past, it happened. Okay? It's not a process. It's not something that's continuous. It's something that happened in the past, and it's passive. That means that you didn't do it. That means that someone else did something to you. That's the word passive. The subject is being acted upon rather than the subject doing the acting. So what this is saying is that God, sometime in the past, declared us righteous, justified us. Justified who? Who did he declare righteous? Those who uk in pisteos. This is therefore since. You can add the word since when you have an aorist passive. Therefore, since we have been justified from faith. This is a causal word. It causes something. What does it cause? Ereinin, peace. Ekomen, we have peace. Prostantheion, with God. Dia, to, through. Kurio, Hemon, our Lord, Jesu Christo, Jesus Christ. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God. So what is Paul saying? He's saying justification comes by faith, but it is an event that happens somewhere in time. It's not continuous. That's not what the Hutterites are saying. That's not what the Moravians were saying. It's not what the Catholics were saying. That's not what the Puritans were saying. You've got to toe the line in this Christian life. No, Paul says there comes a time when you place your faith in Christ, when God declares you righteous right then. Right at that moment. And folks, that's why I'm a Baptist. Because that's what we teach. And listen, what we teach is what people need to hear. Now, as we close, not by duress. They don't need to hear by force. What does each person have? They have this stuff inside that is sacred. It's a place we call free will. It's a place that we call freedom of conscience. And our job is not to violate that. And sometimes we can do that. Not just by force or coercion, but maybe even by persuasion. We have to be so careful, so delicate when we share the gospel with people so that we are confident that we present the message in such a way that should they decide to ask Jesus to come into their life, it's their decision and not ours. Because if it's our decision and not theirs, what have we achieved? We've just now got somebody to think they're a Christian when they're not really a Christian. We want everybody to open up their heart and trust the Lord to come into their life and believe and align their beliefs and their thinking along with the true orthodox Word of God, but they must come to that decision. And then one of the things that I try to do with people who are still, when you present the gospel, they're not interested, they're not ready, they're putting up walls and blockades and all of that. I'm praying for them that God will penetrate that wall as only He knows how, and I'm praying that God would put people around them that will influence them. So we've been praying for Uncle Tinker. We'll close with this for a long, long time. He's 91 years old. He was about to die in the hospital a couple weeks ago. My whole family's Catholic. As far as I know, my sisters, my dad, my mom, and I were the only ones who have defected. Jump ship. They've never understood. And we've tried to share, just not interested. And so I woke up a couple weeks ago, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I have a dream. I wake up, and I dreamed that we were witnessing to Uncle Tinker in the hospital room in ICU. And I thought to myself, boy, we got to get to Tinker. I don't know that he's ever opened up his heart. I don't think so, but I don't know. No one knows a person's heart but God. So we invited my mother and my sister to come for Thanksgiving, and so my sister called me a couple of days later to make the arrangements for that, and that jogged my memory of my dream. And I said, Charlotte, she's my middle sister. She lives in Houston. You know, they're all in Houston. I said, Charlotte, would you be willing to go and share the gospel with Uncle Tinker in his hospital room? You know, you have a relationship with him. I haven't seen him in years. And she said, yeah. She said, what do I say? And I said, ask him this. Ask him if he knows for sure that when he dies, he's going to go to heaven. He's going to tell you no. He doesn't know. When he tells you that, ask him, how would you like to know? And he's going to say, yeah, I'd like to know. And then you just go down the steps of inviting Jesus to come in your life. And then share the prayer with him, and then pray the prayer with him, and get him to say it out loud. And sure enough, we talked a couple of days later. Well, I didn't tell you this, but my older sister also didn't know that I talked to Charlotte. She talked, Elise called Charlotte, and Charlotte said, Charlotte, I was sitting there having my quiet time, and all of a sudden this thought came in my mind, Tinker's sick, he may be lost, Charlotte needs to go over there and witness to him. And so when Charlotte heard that, she said, this is God. So Charlotte went over there and shared with Uncle Tinker, and out loud, he said the same thing, I don't know, I want to know, and he prayed and asked Jesus to come into his life. And so we thank God for that. But you know, it took a long time. And it took a deathbed experience. Sometimes it does. We need to let God be God and take our hands off, but be faithful to share the message in truth. And I think that's really being a good Baptist. Let's pray. So you just want to make sure that there has been an event in your past that you can go back to, whereby you know that you know that you know that you asked Jesus Christ to come into your life to save you. Maybe there's somebody here today that doesn't know that, but you'd like to know, like my uncle. Pray this prayer with me if you would like to ask Jesus to come into your heart. Dear Lord Jesus, I believe that you are God, and that you died on the cross for me to pay for my sins, that you were buried, and that you rose again to life. Forgive me for my sins. And right now, Lord Jesus, come into my heart and save me. Be the Lord of my life and take me to heaven when I die. And if you just prayed that prayer today, welcome to the family of God. Jesus has kept this promise to you. He's in your life, and he'll be there forever and ever. The next step is to follow the Lord in making that public and baptism. And so you'll want to pray about that and think about that. Hey, talk to me after the service or whenever. And if you prayed that prayer, I'd love to know about it. Maybe there's someone here today who has also prayed and asked Christ to come in your life. You've never followed the Lord in baptism or made it public. You could do that today, or somebody wants to join the church or whatever it is. I'll be standing here at the front. If somebody needs to pray or anything, just stand up and come as we have our time of invitation for just a moment or two while the rest of us pray.